The dust of Main Street settles on Taza's worn moccasins. He stands before the mercantile, a bundle of supple, tanned hide slung over his shoulder. The scent of sage and buckskin is a clean counterpoint to the town's smell of stale beer and manure. From behind the glass, Alara watches him. The whispers have already started, snaking from the saloon porch to the blacksmith's forge. There's that quiet Apache. They murmur, the word quiet a stand-in for a dozen others. Timid, slow, harmless. Sheriff Brody tips his hat with a patronizing grin, the gesture of a man acknowledging a well-behaved dog. Taza just nods, his dark eyes missing nothing. He is a ghost in their world, seen but not understood. But a different kind of dust is on the horizon, carried on a wind that whispers a name of blood and iron: Silas Kane. The town of Dust Devil Gulch mocks the stillness of the Apache trader, unaware that the stillness is not emptiness, but the coiled calm before a storm. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. For 2 years, Taza had been a fixture on the fringe of Dust Devil Gulch. He came into town every few weeks from the canyons that clawed into the vast, sun-baked horizon. His camp was a lean-to and a fire ring, a place so seamlessly part of the landscape it was nearly invisible. He traded goods of exceptional quality, arrowheads chipped from obsidian so sharp they could shave a man's whiskers, leather pouches stitched with a skill that shamed the town's own saddler, and bundles of dried herbs that could break a fever or soothe a deep ache. The people of the town took his goods but offered little in return beyond coin and a polite, impenetrable wall of dismissal. He was an anomaly they tolerated. He did not drink in the saloon, did not gamble, did not speak unless spoken to. His silence was profound, an unnerving stillness in a world of loud boasts and easy talk. They filled that silence with their own assumptions. They saw his downcast eyes as submission, not observation. They mistook his patience for a lack of wit. To them, he was the timid Apache, a name spoken with a casual cruelty that passed for humor among men like Jebediah Smith, the blacksmith, and even Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was derived more from the shine on his badge than any act of courage. Alara Hayes, who ran the mercantile after her father had succumbed to a wasting cough the winter before, was no different at first. She conducted her business with Taza and clipped, professional tones. She measured out flour and salt, counted his coins, and never met his gaze for more than a second. It was easier that way. To engage further was to invite the town's scrutiny, and she already felt the weight of their judgment on her young shoulders, a woman trying to do a man's work. One Tuesday, Taza laid a small, intricately beaded pouch on her counter next to $3 silver. It was for a sack of flour. The pouch alone was worth twice that. "This is too much," Alara said, her voice flat. He pushed it forward a fraction of an inch with one finger. His hands were lean and calloused, but his movements were precise. "For the boy," he said. His voice was low, raspy from disuse, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. Alara frowned, confused. Then she remembered. The week before, young Timothy Miller, son of the town drunk, had been caught trying to steal a biscuit from a cooling rack behind the hotel. Sheriff Brody had hauled him back to his father by the ear, a public spectacle of shame. She had seen Taza watching from the far end of the street, his face a mask of stone. She realized now he had seen the hunger in the boy's eyes. "I can't just take this," she said, feeling a strange prickle of shame. "Trade," he said, the single word an indisputable statement. He took the flour, nodded once, and was gone, leaving the beaded pouch on the smooth, worn wood of the counter. Alara stared after him, the pouch feeling warm in her hand. It was the first crack in the foundation of her prejudice. The name Silas Kane arrived in town like a sickness on the wind. It was first spoken by a half-dead prospector who stumbled into the saloon, his eyes wide with terror. He spoke of a gang, 30 or 40 strong, led by a giant of a man with a beard like rusted wire and eyes like chips of ice. They weren't common bandits. They were a plague. They didn't just rob towns. They broke them, consuming everything of value and leaving behind only fear and wreckage. Sheriff Brody scoffed, polishing his badge on his sleeve. "Just outlaw talk." he declared to the nervous crowd in the saloon. "Drunkards fear. This town's got a sheriff. We're safe." His words were meant to be comforting, but they rang hollow. Dust Devil Gulch was isolated, 100 miles from the nearest fort. They had a dozen able-bodied men, most of them farmers and shopkeepers, not gunfighters. Their safety was an illusion, a thin sheet of glass waiting for a stone. A week later, the illusion shattered. 5 of Kane's men rode into town. They were the vanguard, bristling with pistols and arrogance. They moved with the swagger of apex predators, their eyes cataloging the town's weaknesses. They dismounted in front of the saloon, their laughter loud and grating. Sheriff Brody met them on the boardwalk, his hand hovering nervously near his Colt. "State your business, fellas," he said, trying to project an authority he did not feel. The leader, a man with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer, spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Brody's boots. "Our business is whatever we say it is, Sheriff. We're thirsty." The confrontation was short and humiliating. Brody postured, they laughed. He threatened, they pushed him aside. They drank the saloon dry, terrorized the barmaid, and shot a hole through the mayor's hat for sport. The men of the town watched from their windows, their hands clenched in impotent fury. Taza had been sitting in the shade of the livery stable, mending a strap on his saddlebag. He didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. But Alara, watching from the mercantile doorway, saw his head lift slightly. His dark eyes followed the outlaw's every move, not with fear, but with a cold, analytical intensity. He was not cowering. He was studying them. He noted the way they carried their guns, the brands on their horses, the subtle hierarchy among them. When they finally rode out, promising to return with Kane, Taza's gaze followed them until they were nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. Panic took root in Dust Devil Gulch. Sheriff Brody's bluster evaporated, replaced by a sweaty-palmed fear. He tried to organize a posse, but it was a farce. The men argued over who would lead, what their strategy should be. They were chickens planning to fight a pack of wolves. That evening, as a blood-red sun bled across the sky, Alara made a decision. She locked the door to the mercantile, pulled a shawl over her shoulders, and walked out of town, following the faint trail that led toward the canyons. A knot of fear and uncertainty tightened in her stomach. She didn't know what she hoped to accomplish. Warn him? Plead with him to flee? Or was she, in some desperate, unexamined part of her soul, seeking help from the one person the town had always overlooked? She found his camp nestled in a small box canyon, so perfectly hidden she almost walked past it. The fire was small, nearly smokeless. A piece of rabbit sizzled over the coals. Taza was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply stopped his work and watched her approach. "You should leave," she said, her voice thin in the vast quiet. "They're coming back. A lot of them. They'll kill anyone who gets in their way." He looked at the knife in his hand, its edge gleaming in the firelight. "I know. You know? 5 men. 2 Winchesters, 7 Colts. One man rides heavy on his left side. His horse favors its right foreleg. They ride for a larger group, camped 2 days north, near the Black Mesa." He spoke calmly, listing facts as if reading from a ledger. Alara stared at him, dumbfounded. He had seen all of that? While the rest of them had been paralyzed by fear, he had been dissecting the threat with chilling precision. "Then you must go," she insisted. "There's nothing for you here. This isn't your fight." He finally looked up, and for the first time, she met his eyes directly. They were not timid. They were ancient and deep, filled with a sorrow and a strength she couldn't begin to comprehend. "The boy who steals biscuits," he said softly. "The woman who runs the store alone. The old man who sleeps behind the church. Is it not their fight either?" He was not talking about a town. He was talking about people. He saw them not as a collective that scorned him, but as individuals, vulnerable and exposed. He had been watching over them all along. "What can one man do against 40? She whispered, the question full of despair. Taza stood up. He was not a large man, but in the fading light, framed against the towering canyon walls, he seemed to possess an impossible gravity. He gestured to the landscape around them, the rocks, the shadows, the thorny brush. "Here," he said, his voice resonating with a power she had never heard. "I am not one man." 2 days later, Silas Kane and his gang descended on Dust Devil Gulch. They came not like a storm, but like a flood, pouring into the single street until it seemed the town would burst at the seams. Kane was everything the prospector had said and more. He rode a massive black stallion and sat in the saddle like a king on a throne of leather and steel. He took over the hotel, throwing the mayor out of his own office. He posted his men on rooftops and at both ends of town. Dust Devil Gulch became a prison. The first day was a nightmare of quiet terror. The gang drank, gambled, and took what they wanted from the stores without payment. Alara stood behind her counter, her face pale, a shotgun hidden beneath it, feeling its uselessness like a cold weight. The townsmen stayed in their homes, the swagger gone, replaced by the grim reality of their cowardice. Sheriff Brody was a prisoner in his own office, a symbol of the town's broken authority. Kane and his lieutenants were in the saloon, their laughter echoing through the silent, terrified streets. They were planning to stay, to pick the town clean at their leisure. They were arrogant, overconfident, and utterly contemptuous of the sheep they had corralled. They never once thought to look to the shadows at the edge of town. They never once thought about the timid Apache trader. As the second sun set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the town held its breath, waiting for the night's new terrors. The air grew still. The first outlaw to die was a man named Cletus, posted as a sentry on the roof of the bank. He was watching the street below, bored, when a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadow of the water tower behind him. There was no sound, just a whisper of movement and the soft thud of a body slumping to the tar paper roof. An hour later, two of Kane's men, drunk and looking for trouble, stumbled down the alley beside the mercantile. They were halfway down the narrow passage when a length of rope, thin and strong as wire, dropped over the head of the man in the rear. He was jerked off his feet, a choked gasp his only cry, and pulled vertically into the darkness above. His partner turned, his pistol drawn, seeing only an empty alley. He stared, confused, his drunken brain trying to make sense of the impossible. He didn't see the figure drop from the awning above him until a knife slid between his ribs, silencing him forever. Panic began as a low murmur among the gang. Men sent on errands failed to return. The sentries Kane had so confidently posted began to feel the oppressive weight of the darkness around them. They started at every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind whistling around a corner. Taza moved through the town like a vengeful spirit. He knew its secret ways, the gaps between buildings, the rickety ladders to the rooftops, the cellar doors hidden behind overgrown bushes. He had spent 2 years observing, learning the town's rhythms and its geography. Now, he used that knowledge as a weapon. He created diversions. A small, smoky fire started in a trash barrel behind the blacksmith shop drew 3 men to investigate. They found nothing but embers. On their way back to the saloon, one of them tripped over a wire stretched taut at ankle height. As he fell, a shape rose from a horse trough, silent as the grave, and the other 2 men fell with knives in their backs before they could even cry out. The first man was dispatched just as quickly. Inside the saloon, Silas Kane was growing angry. His men were spooked, telling wild stories of ghosts and demons. He slammed his fist on the bar, rattling bottles. "It's one man," he roared, his voice thick with whiskey and rage. "Some yellow-bellied farmer with a lucky shot. Find him. I want his head on a platter." He sent 10 men out in a sweep, a show of overwhelming force. Taza faded before them. He led them on a chase through the back alleys and livery stables, never letting them see him, only the results of his passing. He used their numbers against them, funneling them into narrow spaces where they got in each other's way. A thrown rock would send them blasting away at shadows, their bullets ripping through empty sheds. In the confusion, another 1 or 2 would disappear, dragged into the darkness or felled by a silent arrow from an unseen perch. By the time the sun began to hint at its return, Kane's gang of nearly 40 men had been reduced by more than a third. Their bravado was gone, replaced by a primal, superstitious fear. They were no longer hunters, they were the hunted. They clustered together in the relative light of the saloon, their eyes wide, jumping at every sound. The town of Dust Devil Gulch was no longer a prize. It was a tomb. Alara had watched the night's events from the small window of her apartment above the store. She saw flashes of movement, heard choked cries and the sudden, sharp report of a pistol fired at nothing. She saw the confident swagger of the outlaws decay into a frantic, fearful scramble. She was witnessing not a fight, but a reaping. The timid man she thought she knew was dismantling a force of nature, piece by agonizing piece. As dawn broke, casting long, skeletal shadows down the street, Taza made his final move. He strode out from the space between the barber shop and the assay office, walking into the middle of the street. He carried only his knife and a single-shot rifle held loosely in one hand. He was no longer hiding. The sight of him, a lone figure standing in the dawn light, was so audacious it momentarily stunned the remaining outlaws in the saloon. Silas Kane, his face bloated and red with fury and drink, kicked the saloon doors open and stalked onto the porch, flanked by his last dozen men. "You," Kane bellowed, his voice cracking. "You're the ghost." Taza didn't answer. He just stood there, his stillness a stark contrast to Kane's trembling rage. He was calm, centered, a rock in the middle of a turbulent river. "One man." Kane laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "We're going to tear you apart." He raised his pistol. Before he could fire, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer rang out from down the street, a single, defiant strike of steel on steel. Then, from the hotel, a window slammed shut. A door creaked open at the livery. The town, which had been silent and terrified, was beginning to make noise. They weren't fighting, not yet, but they were bearing witness. They were no longer hiding. The subtle sounds were enough to unnerve Kane's men. Their eyes darted from Taza to the buildings around them, suddenly seeing threats in every window, behind every door. Their unity, already fractured by fear, began to dissolve completely. Kane saw their hesitation, and his rage boiled over. He was a wolf who ruled by fear, and fear was now being used against him. "Kill him!" he screamed, leveling his pistol and firing. The shot was wild. Taza had moved with a speed that was almost imperceptible, diving and rolling behind a water trough. The bullet splintered the wood where he had been standing. Before Kane could fire again, Taza had the rifle at his shoulder. He didn't aim for Kane. He aimed for the saloon sign above his head. The rifle cracked once. The heavy wooden sign, its supports severed by the well-placed shot, groaned and crashed down onto the porch, taking two of Kane's men with it, and sending the rest scattering in a panic of splinters and dust. In that single moment of chaos, Taza was on his feet and moving. He closed the distance to the porch with the fluid grace of a panther. Kane, staggering back from the wreckage, barely had time to turn before Taza was on him. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a dismantling. Taza's hand shot out, grabbing Kane's wrist and twisting with brutal efficiency. Bones snapped. The gun clattered to the boardwalk. Taza's other hand brought the hilt of his knife up under Kane's jaw, a sharp, decisive blow that sent the giant outlaw stumbling backward, his eyes rolling up in his head before he collapsed in an unconscious heap. The remaining outlaws, leaderless, terrified, and utterly broken, threw down their guns. Some ran for their horses, fleeing into the wilderness. Others simply raised their hands in surrender, their faces pale with shock. The fight was over. The sun was fully up now, bathing the street in a clean, golden light. Townsfolk emerged from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of disbelief, shame, and profound awe. They saw the bodies of the outlaws. They saw the surrendered men being tied up by a newly courageous Sheriff Brody. And they saw Taza, standing calmly over the unconscious form of Silas Kane. He was not breathing heavily. He was not bleeding. He simply stood there, the quiet center of the storm he had unleashed and controlled. He looked up, and his eyes swept over the faces of the people of Dust Devil Gulch. The mockery was gone. The condescension had vanished. In its place was a deep, humbling respect. Alara walked out of the mercantile, her hidden shotgun forgotten. She crossed the street, her steps sure and steady, and stopped a few feet from him. The entire town watched in silence. "We were wrong about you," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the morning air. It was more than an apology, it was a confession. Taza looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened for just a moment. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He then bent down, retrieved his knife, and without another word, turned and began to walk away, his form melting back toward the canyons that were his home. But this time, as he left, no one whispered insults. They watched in silent, grateful reverence, finally understanding that the town's greatest strength had been the timid man they had never bothered to see. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.